Good afternoon, everyone, and everyone who's watching on the web. I'm Stephen Klimt, and I'm a partner at Clayton Utz, and I'm hosting this afternoon or this lunchtime session. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're undertaking this presentation on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. What we'll do with this session is we will start this session with I'll start this session with a short PowerPoint and setting the scene, and then we will go to the Q&A with our two distinguished speakers. So, firstly, what happened? Well, simply put, for those who don't know, Trump won. The actual vote, the vote that's really important is the Electoral College votes of the votes for each of the states. And that finished with Trump 312 to Harris 226. And Trump carried all 7 swing states, which were the states that were the most closely contested states. Interestingly, this year, for the first time since 2004, the Republicans, Trump won the popular vote. He didn't quite get 50%. He got 49.94%. They're still counting, actually. So it was last time I looked on the weekend, to 74.4 million votes, or 48.33% for Harris. The Senate finished up Republicans 53, Democrats 47. Now that's quite significant because it means that the Republicans have a margin to get votes through, and particularly to get confirmations through of positions such as Supreme Court judges. And there are 2 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Suzanne Collins of Maine, who are in a number of cases are more likely not to support Republican nominees than otherwise. So Republicans have some breathing space in that regard. Then the House of Representatives was very close, 220 to 214, with 1 undecided as we speak. And that is likely to get closer if a number of Trump's cabinet nominees are confirmed, because a number of them come from the House of Representatives and will need to be replaced. So let's look at how the votes changed. Trump ended up getting 2.5 million more votes than he got in 2020. And conversely, Kamala Harris had 7.1 million fewer votes than Biden got in 2020. And if you have a look at the map on the left of the screen, that shows effectively the swings from 2020. And the red swings are swings in favour of Trump, and blue are in favour of Harris. That's Harris's vote compared to Biden's vote. And you'll see from that there's a lot more bolder red lines and red shading than there is blue, which is much fainter. And what you'll see is, if you look at California, New York, and Florida, large population centres show very heavy red shading. And that may well explain and be the point where Trump picked up the popular vote that he didn't win as much of last time. Now on to exit polls. Exit polls are essentially taken by pollsters as people have voted, asking people how they voted, and then the statistics are compiled. Political scientists are sometimes very cynical about exit polls and exit poll data, so you perhaps need to take some of the exit poll data with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I took the CNN exit polls, and you'll see I've put the numbers and the statistics up on the screen there. And the critical factors seem to me in this exit polls are Trump won 45 to 64-year-olds by 10 points, which, because they're 35% of the electorate, of the overall electorate that voted, that appears quite determinative. Also, Trump won males by a significantly greater margin than Harris won females, a 12% margin as opposed to an 8% margin. Whites were 71% of the electorate that voted and had a 15% margin in favour of Trump. And then, interestingly, the Latino vote was close to even, but in the past it had been strongly Democratic. And then finally, the margin for Trump with low-income earners was the same as the margin for Trump for Harris with higher income earners, but there were more lower income earners. So that's a snapshot of what might explain how people voted. Now, the final set of numbers I wanted to draw to your attention are the opinion polls. I've put up the final margins in the key poll averaging sites. They are Real Clear Politics, 538.com, the New York Times, and Nate Silver. And I've done that for the 7 swing states that are listed there, and the national vote at the bottom, the popular national vote at the bottom. And I've averaged the averaging, and it appears, as you'll see in the final column, there's an across-the-board underestimate for Trump of around 2%. You'll see some are a bit higher, some are a bit lower, but it seems around the 2% mark. Now, what pollsters will tell you is that's the margin of error. So you have a look at the polls before, you see, well, who's going to win? All in a margin of error doesn't tell you terribly much ultimately. Now, finally, I thought I'd show you a few key moments in the campaign. And for me, these 2 images sum up the campaign from Trump's perspective. The image on the left is Trump after the assassination attempt, bloodied, with fist raised, shouting, "Fight, fight, fight." And the image on the right is Trump in an apron serving fries at McDonald's. And he said at the time, I've now worked 15 minutes at McDonald's, which is 15 minutes longer than Kamala Harris worked there. So that, and then I'm going to show you some ads that were shown in the campaign, because I think these are exemplars of some of the critical issues in the campaign. The Trump campaign put this ad out within an hour of Harris's appearance on The View.
Well, if anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Then for this ad, the Trump campaign apparently spent $200 million in the closing weeks of the campaign, and there was significantly no real response to it by the Harris campaign.
He murdered a father of 3, sentenced to life in prison. Kamala Harris pushed to use tax dollars to pay for his sex change.
I made sure that they changed the policy so that every transgender inmate would have access.
It sounds insane because it is insane. Kamala was the first to help pay for a prisoner's sex change.
The power that I had, I used it in a way that was about pushing for the movement, frankly, and the agenda.
Kamala's agenda is they, them, not you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
And finally, James Carville is the legendary Democratic strategist responsible for Bill Clinton's win in 1996. He's a centrist Democrat, and I thought he gave a fairly pithy explanation for the outcome on his podcast a few days after the election.
Okay, I think there were a couple big mistakes and something overreaching. First of all, correct. If by Biden staying in so late, we didn't have any process. We had all of this unused cordwood sitting on the sideline. Okay, and I mean really good unused. You know that if we'd have had some kind of an open process, and it would have been much better. It might, like I said, it could have been worse, but it sure could have been a lot better. And you're correct that she didn't separate herself from Biden. But what killed the Democrats and what killed Biden was a sense of disorder. And part of the sense of disorder was the unfortunate events of what I would refer to as the woke era. We got beyond it, but the image stuck in people's minds that the Democrats wanted to defund the police, that they wanted to empty prisons. You know, the immigration stuff, obviously, again, a big mistake, but more importantly, it created to the perception of disorder. The Afghanistan withdrawal, while I think Biden was 100% right in getting out, it was disorderly. Inflation was a sign of people's disorder, that there wasn't anyone in charge. And, you know, if we learn anything from this, is change is what wins elections, particularly, you know, people are pointing out, you know, it's a 65% wrong track country. And in a 65% wrong track country, we were offering people the same track. And you know, you can say it's easy in hindsight, but the basic fundamentals of politics were not being paid attention to. And you're right, the campaign didn't, except for that one answer, which was the money question, by the way. Just say that one question, but that one question became the whole definition of the campaign. And, you know, if you answer 99 questions really well, but you get the big one wrong, the outcome is going to be wrong.
Well, we now go to the Q&A, and we're very fortunate to have two outstanding panellists. On my immediate left is Justice Lee of the Federal Court. The judge is a distinguished judge who, prior to going to the bench, had a stellar career as a barrister, including pioneering a lot of class action law. But more significantly, from our perspective today, the judge is a US politics tragic. And next to him is Dr. Lavina Lee. Dr. Lavina is a senior lecturer in security studies at Macquarie Uni, and she's also a senior fellow at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And Lavina tells me that she was in fact offered a summer clerkship at Clayton Utz, but declined. So now she has a chance to make amends. So I'll start with you, Judge. The polls ultimately yet underestimated the Trump vote. Is that just due to unresponsive Trump voters? Can this ever be rectified? And finally, Judge, as someone who successfully tipped the outcome of the election, what data points did you use to make your assessment?
Well, Stephen knows I've been an American political tragic for many years, but also a British political tragic. But what I want to do is make sure I get through this next period without expressing any political opinions whatsoever, given my position. But there is an issue with polling, and an issue with polling in the United States. The first point to make is that national polls are completely irrelevant. Stephen mentioned the fact that Donald Trump got 49.94% vote. He's the first Republican since 2004 to win.
Oh.
Is this working now? Yeah. Someone actually did tell me to press the button, but I forgot. No one missed any words of wisdom. Let me get back to where I was. He won 49.94% of the vote. That was the first time since 2004, the election between President Bush and John Kerry, where a Republican has won the popular vote. What matters is the Electoral College, so the laser-like focus must be on the polls in those states that matter. In the last election, that was 7 states. But there is a problem with polling underestimating Trump voters. In 2016, there was an underestimate, I think, of 3.2%, and in 2020, 4.1%. That's a reflection of a number of things. A lot of people, particularly people who may feel some degree of antagonism towards what I broadly describe as elites or the establishment, are possibly somewhat wary of being rung up by pollsters. For example, according to a pollster I heard speaking a couple of weeks ago, in order to get 12 complete responses to a polling questionnaire, one needs to make probably somewhere between 1,000 or 1,200 attempts in order to procure that information. That shows you just how difficult it is to get accurate polling. So there is an underestimate of Trump's vote, and I think it may be something to do with the willingness of people to respond to pollsters. Additionally, there's a bit of herding that goes on. On the Wednesday, I think it was, on the Saturday before the Tuesday election, Ann Seltzer, who is one of the most famous pollsters who does work for the Des Moines Register, did a poll of Iowa and said that Harris was leading by 3 points, I think it was, and showing this massive swing, mainly among women, towards Harris. Everyone thought that is, and it immediately got placed in the narrative. There's this huge surge for Harris. It was obviously an outlier. It was never going to be a situation where she had any chance of winning Iowa, and predictably, she lost it by, I think, 8 points or 7 or 8 points. So there's a lot of inaccuracy pollings. My analysis, and I got 312 on the button, I was out by one electoral vote in 2020. I had a feeling about 2016, but I can't say they got it right, but I've got all the other ones right since I started being involved in this, including 2000. It seemed to me there was so much wishful thinking going on. I went around to a number of seminars, about 4 or 5 seminars, where everyone was predicting a Harris win. And I kept on saying, are you looking at the data? Are you looking at what happened in the movement in registrations? For example, in Pennsylvania, there's, I think, 74 counties. Out of 73 of 74 counties, there had been a significant increase in Republican registrations between 2020 and 2024. Northampton, which is the bellwether county in Pennsylvania, the Republican registrations had grown even more. The chances of her winning Pennsylvania, given the difference, Democrats have to be so far ahead on registrations in order for a Democrat to win that state. It just seemed to me she was never really in the race. And I listened to a couple of commentators who really went down into the registration data in the swing states. So I thought if you're looking at it objectively, rather than looking at it through a prism of really wanting to look at any data point which supported your wishes and the outcome of the election, which I think so many commentators did, then what happened was not in the least surprising.
Now, interestingly, I think Ann Seltzer has announced after the election that she's given up electoral polling. So, Lavina, the Trump dance, which is defined in Wikipedia as slowly punching the air and shaking hips to the tune of YMCA, is literally sweeping the world at the moment, from sports stars using it to celebrate goals and touchdowns to flash mobs at Staten Island post-Thanksgiving. And Donald Trump and his supporters have described his election win as a mandate. But what's the makeup of the Trump coalition? What were the demographics of the voters and the issues that gave him wins in all of the swing states and indeed the popular vote?
I think your analysis earlier was very instructive. So there you talked about.
You can come back.
You had a really good slide from the CNN exit polls that talks about the different demographics, but it's a very broad coalition. So I think he maintained his traditional coalition. The traditional coalition were the white working class voters that we all know that live in the Rust Belts, that are really concerned about losing jobs and manufacturing, all of those kinds of things. But he also increased his vote among the non-college educated voters. There were an increase in voting for Trump amongst this group. There are also the older voters over 45s voted more for Trump than for Harris, rural voters. But I think more surprisingly, I think because the Democrats, assume that certain identity groups will always vote Democrat. I think that was something that was very interesting about this election, is that the coalition that he built included an increase in votes by Black American men. So he doubled the number of Black American men that would vote for him. He also increased the vote amongst Hispanics, so around a 14-point increase in the Hispanic vote. And for me, that was probably the most surprising, given how strongly he ran on immigration. So when you look at some of the exit polling and the interviews with a lot of Hispanic voters, even before I remember seeing this, is that they were very concerned about uncontrolled immigration, which you'd think was surprising, that probably a lot of people they knew might be affected by a change in the kind of regulation of immigration, but they too were concerned about uncontrolled immigration, that they supported stronger border controls. And I also think there's some evidence to suggest that they view the Republicans now as, and Republican values as representing them more clearly, their own values, than the Democrats themselves.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Judge, I want to come to a question that's probably the key issue for many people outside the USA in relation to Donald Trump. I can probably list a whole series of facts about Donald Trump that by conventional wisdom would mean that he was unelectable. The main example from the 2016 election was, of course, the Access Hollywood tape. But more recent examples include his 2020 election result denial and his conduct of 6 January 2021, a civil court finding of sexual abuse and battery against him, and his false comments on the campaign trail, such as the allegation that Haitian immigrants were killing and eating pets. But this clearly didn't stop him from being re-elected or elected again, notwithstanding the significant coverage given to this in the mainstream media and the efforts of the Democrats. Why?
Because 28% of people thought the United States was on the right track. You heard James Carville talk about the fact that there was a 65% wrong track country. The obverse of that was that the fact that only 28% of people thought that the United States was on the right track. In circumstances where Trump's approval rating from the moment that he left office, and after January 6 was at its trough, had increased significantly and was running probably about 10 points ahead of the current president's approval rating at the time of the election. So, and the person who was going to win was the person who most reflected change. And immediately after she was first nominated, there was a surprising bounce in the polls for her, which was connected to her people seeing her as a change candidate. That was one of the reasons why that first clip that you showed was so important. Her basically being tarred with the fact that she was part of a Biden and Harris administration. It was not the Biden administration, it was Biden-Harris administration in all the Republican messaging at the convention. So these other things that you've mentioned of Donald Trump, which so exercised what I'll describe as the legacy media, really just didn't cut through. And people wanted a change, and they were more focused on their hip pockets rather than what might be described as elite opinion. Indeed, when it came to what is perhaps pejoratively described as the lawfare, I have absolutely no doubt that looking at just politically, the attempts at bringing both the 2 federal prosecutions against Trump and the 2 state prosecutions plainly helped him in that it coalesced opinion around him in the Republican Party, thinking he was a victim. He had, I think, quite a line, which I think is perhaps underestimated its importance, where he would say all of his rallies, they're coming for you, but they've got to go through me. So a lot of his voters were willing to forgive what other people described as these flaws, which I won't go into, because they saw him as someone with whom they felt a connection, some association.
Lavina, Does Joe Biden bear responsibility for the Democratic Party loss? And could things have been different had he got out of the race earlier, or even made it clear that he wouldn't run at all?
Well, look, with the benefit of hindsight, I'd say there'd be a lot of people in the Democratic Party now being very upset with Joe Biden, especially on the day. But I remember going to the United States a couple of times last year and asking people in Washington, when they looked at Joe Biden, we see it on YouTube, we see the infirmity, we see him stumbling over words. And I said to them then, I mean, do you really think that Joe Biden could run again? I mean, he's looking pretty bad. And that was a year ago. But they said, no, he's okay. They're just selectively picking out his worst moments and doing a collage. So in some senses, there's a kind of collective covering up of his infirmity and his inability to actually run again. And I think in hindsight, he really should have stepped down in the midterms. It's probably too much to expect a person to necessarily see their own flaws. I have my own elderly parents that I'm always trying to get them to do less rather than more. And they refuse. But I think what the Democratic Party leadership, they really should have stepped in that midterm period and said, okay, it's time for us to have an actual primary. And the purpose of the primary is it's a very democratic process. And it allows a whole bunch of candidates to put themselves forward, to be rigorously tested, to put their ideas out in the marketplace and to see whether they are being responded to positively. And if they're not, then people fall away. And the best candidate should emerge, the one that's the most battle-hardened should emerge. So they didn't go through that process. And if we remember that Kamala Harris actually was knocked out first in the previous primary. So she was never going to be a strong candidate. She hadn't performed very well as a vice president. So there was a lot riding on what was actually quite a poor candidate. And they did attempt to type of shield her. So you know that she didn't really have a lot of scrutiny from the media. She had a lot of scripted interviews, very soft interviews. And in a sense, she did the best she could with a very short period of time, but it would have been pretty much a miracle, I think, for her in the end to be able to convince the electorate, given that she wasn't able to, as you said, put forward a positive agenda for change. She really didn't express what she would do differently to Biden other than saying, I like that clip that you showed. That was a key one.
And can I just pick up quickly on what something Lavina said? And that is, if you want to do some homework, you heard James Carville earlier a couple of months ago that there was a new documentary put out by him called Carville Winning Is Everything Stupid, which I think you can get if you use geo-blockers. And it starts with a poll in the middle of 2013, effectively where Carville is saying this man is unelectable. Listen to what people are saying about his current state. So it was not as if it was not known by some people.
Well, I mean, on that point, and on the ad, the Harris campaign's attempt to distance her from Biden were largely negligible. And interestingly, senior Harris campaign staff are now, and maybe that's trying to protect their own position, but are now saying essentially that her response on the view that I showed was largely scripted, and they determined it, and they wanted her to answer that way. And I've heard other people say, well, look, really, she had no choice but to align herself with Biden. All hell would have broken loose had she not done that. Could she have handled things differently, Judge? And how could she have done that?
Well, you're talking about this. There's a Pod Save America podcast where all the hierarchy of the Harris campaign are doing. It came out and talked over a period of about an hour and 40 minutes, and it was fairly, how can I put it,
self-serving.
Self-serving. I would have thought that if you looked at her reaction when she was asked that question, that didn't sound to me like a particularly scripted answer. She seemed perplexed that she was asked it, really. She may have been, it seemed to me an obvious question. She may not have been expecting it from the View. But it was obviously a change election, it seems to me, going back to the point I was making before, where only 28% of people thought the United States was on the right track. She had a difficulty as an incumbent vice president, obviously, in disassociating herself. But there are historical parallels. In 1968, after a very contentious year and Bobby Kennedy being assassinated and Martin Luther King being assassinated, and at a convention in Chicago that was a complete fiasco, they went back to the Vice President of the United States to run a campaign. And he started well behind Richard Nixon, who ran an incredibly disciplined campaign focusing on disorder in the United States.
That was Hubert Humphrey.
Hubert Humphrey, yeah. And Hubert Humphrey started gaining in the goal. And he was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, a very unpopular president who in March of that year, like President Biden, says, I will not accept a nomination for another term of my party as your president. And he started to grow in the polls, and it was an absolute squeaker of an election as he distanced himself quite considerably from Lyndon Johnson. Now, she probably needed, it seemed to me, a moment where in some way she needed to distance herself. But I think she was so tarred with what became the more unpopular aspects of the Biden administration. Maybe it was difficult for her to do it.
Yeah, something I think you agree with, Lavina.
Yeah, I think this is more behind the scenes, but I know people who have worked for her, and they have often said to me that she doesn't prepare well for interviews and for public performing roles. And so she had a lot of turnover in her own staff, which is indicative of perhaps that level of disappointment that she wasn't able to be prepared.
That's an interesting point, because I think the publicity that was surrounding her was she's a former district attorney, a former prosecutor. She prepares and does everything, and she had a very good debate performance in
That's
fairness
right.
to her. So,
Right.
But on another point, the legendary New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd wrote a now famous column, and it was only written on the 9th of November of this year in the immediate aftermath of the Trump win, which commenced, some Democrats are finally waking up and realising that woke is broke. And as you heard, James Carville attributes it as a factor contributing to the Trump loss, and the Trump campaign devoted a significant amount of its resources to campaigning on that issue as well. How important was the so-called woke issues in the outcome of the election?
I think there's a connection there between what Justice Lee was saying before about the 2/3 thinking the country is not going in the right direction. So when you look at the election, it was fundamentally very traditional. It was very much, if we think of previous elections where they say it's the economy, stupid. We almost think the Democrats actually forgot a little bit about that people were not happy with the economy. They saw high inflation, wages not keeping up with living standards, with prices, living standards declining. They saw insecure, disorderly neighborhoods. Immigration was actually a big factor, the fact that uncontrolled borders, and a lot of border governors were quite clever in a lot of ways to send busloads of immigrants to some of the East Coast cities to say, this is not just our problem, this is your problem as well. So it became much more real, I think, to people, that level of disorder. And it fed into something that I think we shouldn't really be surprised about, because that's what Trump was successful on in 2016, that this idea that the elites are out of touch with the realities of normal people's lives, that they're too focused on pronouns, not on the economy, and that they didn't understand that the ordinary working class person was not getting ahead. They didn't feel like they could plan for their future, and that it is the elites, the kind of elites that I'm afraid that we probably all are, the academics like myself, the well-educated, the media, the politicians, have created a world that benefits us more than it benefits them. And they don't see that this is a system that represents their future. So I think that it did play a big part in that, to see that Democrats were perceived to be the party of the elites and the urban elites.
And will it change anything in the way the way so-called woke issues are now treated in America or even further around the world?
Well, it comes with recognition. One of the interesting things in that Pod Save America podcast that we mentioned, and I was very surprised when I heard this. Effectively, it was quite a senior, it wasn't David Plouffe, it was one of the other people whose names I can't recall, batting back that criticism by saying, we didn't run on those sort of issues. Well, that's not the point. The point is Republicans ran on those issues and pounded you to death. And you can see that from the ads that you showed at the beginning. She's for they, them, I'm Trump is for you. And the reality is that the first step, if the Democratic Party is going to change in that regard, is a recognition that that is a difficulty. I'll only disassociate myself. I don't regard myself as an elite. You can take the boy out of Parramatta, but he can't take the Parramatta out of the boy.
No, federal court judges.
And I'm touching.
Federal court judges are not the elite of our
exactly. I'm a simple working class lad who can see their problems.
You're a sympathetic elite.
Yes.
How's that?
Yeah.
Lavina, it's been said that the re-election of Donald Trump carries dire consequences for US democracy. What now for the state of US democracy?
Okay, well, look, I think we have to remember that the US system is a bit different to our system. We can expect that Trump will use his appointments. So, the top layers of the bureaucracy, he's now going about that process of appointing people who are loyal to him, who see the world as he sees it. So I think that Trump will hit the ground running in a way that he never did in the his previous term. I think in terms of the Justice Department, he has said that he will go after those people who targeted him using the Justice Department. So that's what we can expect to see. But I also think that we have to remind ourselves that even in the Justice Department, so justices, judges, prosecutors in the United States are all appointed. It's not the kind of system that we see here. And I guess one thing that came out really strongly this week was President Biden's pardon of his own son. So we know that the Democrats ran very strongly on this idea that democracy was under threat if you saw a Trump win. But there were a lot of Democrats, I think, a bit perplexed, obviously Republicans outraged by the scope of the pardon that Biden has given to his own child, that he has basically pardoned 2 convictions. He's already been convicted, that he was about to be sentenced, but that now is not going to happen. And the scope of the pardon that he's given is essentially to say anything that he has done in the past 10 years, will not be able to be prosecuted. And that's the kind of scope of pardon that we saw Gerald Ford give to President Nixon. That's how big a pardon it is. So for us, it's quite an anomaly. We have this concept of the rule of law that we would find this outrageous. I think a lot of people would find this outrageous, but it is part of their system. So I think the only other point I'd like to make is I think there's also part of a democratic system is also systems of accountability within society. And there is a very low perception of the independence of the media in the United States. So I think that's only more cemented the kind of overwhelming media. I guess traditional media has been very anti-Trump. So people are much more skeptical about the role of the media. So that's a problem for American democracy as well.
And I mean, following on from that, Judge, while it's probably clear that 2024 was a change election, as you've both spoken of earlier, does it also suggest that there's a major realignment in politics?
Well, It's such a huge country. Things are already changing. I think one of the most interesting realignments is a breakdown on some of the Democratic coalition. For example, Lavina mentioned the fact that the performance by Trump with respect to black males is the best performance since Richard Nixon, I think in 1972. However, the more graphic example of this is the broad Hispanic group of voters, where the Republicans have done so much better than they've ever done before. And that's been quite a dramatic and sudden shift over the course of the last couple of elections. So yes, there are realignments occurring all the time. Now, one of the things and one of the beauties of our system compared to the United States system is that it tends to push people to polarities. If you look at the seats in the US House of Representatives and you look at the 2 Senate seats for each state, most of those people are going to be pretty confident. There's very few swing seats, for example, in the House of Representatives. If you are going to lose your seat, you're going to be primaried. You're going to lose it to someone who, if you're a Republican, who primaries you in the Republican Party. If you're a Democrat, who primaries you in the Democratic primary. Generally from the left, from the Democrats, generally from the right for a Republican. So it does encourage you not to reach across the aisle. It does encourage you to constantly be concerned about how your votes can be portrayed. That is something which is increasing, and that's a further, it seems to me, pretty much a structural difficulty in the way the US Constitution works. You're going to have a situation with if the filibuster stays in place, where 17% of the population can vote for senators, which can stop legislation because it is skewed in favour of small states. That's not a very little d democratic institution. And these tensions are inbuilt into the system. But yes, it's dynamic, it's changing. Nothing's permanent. I don't think there will be permanent. A lot of it's, I think, also based on the personality of Trump. Hate him or love him, as he's someone who inspires strong feelings either way. But nobody should deny his ability to connect to certain voters which have been unconnectable by other politicians. How that survives Trump is, I think, a very big question. Will a J.D. Vance, will a Ron DeSantis, will a Ted Cruz, will some other Republican politician have that ability is very much, I think, open to question.
Okay, well, perhaps turning the focus a bit broader, Lavina, during the campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly said that after he was elected, he would end the war in Ukraine and in a day. And I know this is a very broad question, but can you briefly outline the key strategic issues the US and the Western world are facing and how they're likely to be handled by the new Trump administration?
Look, on Ukraine, he did say that, and J.D. Vance also said that, Ukrainian membership of NATO is not on the cards, that Ukraine would effectively have to give up territory and that they would force Ukraine to make a deal with Putin. So that's J.D. Vance, probably giving us an indication of what Trump might be wanting to do. What has been interesting the last few days, you heard Zelensky come out and for the first time say, yes, we will accept some territorial losses, whereas he's been very much on all for no, never surrender. We will fight to the end and we'll try and get back Crimea even. I think what's going to happen is that he will force the Ukraine to make a deal because they're in a weak position. Without the United States arming them, they've basically got no choice but to accept what the US wants them to do. The European Union, they've been attempting to improve their defence spending and their defence industrial complex, their ability to produce weapons, and haven't been able to. So they haven't been able to keep that up. And Trump is very much of the view that the primary concern for the United States is China and that they need to get out get out of this Ukraine conflict. So the big thing will be, will they support Ukraine as a member of NATO, or will they force them essentially to accept territorial losses without that protection? In my view, I think that would be a mistake. If they're going to get Ukraine to accept these losses of territory, they also have to allow Ukraine to have membership of NATO, because that, if they don't, I think that might inherently embolden Putin to do more than just stop at Ukraine. That's the real concern.
Okay. I want to also just follow that up with a question of probably about the key issue, I think, affecting Australia. And a couple of weeks ago, I attended the US Center's annual strategy forum. And a key theme of many of the presenters, of which you were one of them, was the need for the West to increase its deterrence efforts and its deterrence steps in relation to China. And this may be occurring at the same time as President Trump introduces a changed US trade policy with foreshadowed significant increases in US tariffs. Given, and this is the big dilemma, given China is Australia's major trading partner, where does this place Australia and what should we be doing?
Okay. They say Trump is transactional. And when it comes to allies, I think the major takeaway is all allies have to do more, including us. So he will be looking at every single ally and saying, okay, what do we get out of this? What does the United States get out of supporting Australia's own deterrence? We have our own, obviously, our own defence capabilities, but without the United States, we effectively have no real deterrence capabilities. We don't have long-range strike. We have aspirations to do a lot of more forward-leaning things. But as you know, we don't have submarines. We have one working submarine at the present time. We have an aspiration to have a nuclear submarine, 3 American Virginia class by around 2033. We're not sure whether we'll get them, but we have that aspiration. The government, the current government, has plans to improve our naval capabilities. But again, all of that is not happening until 2033, 2034. So Trump will come in, he'll look at that and say, okay, I thought you say, as in our own defence documents say, that we're in the worst strategic circumstances since World War II, yet we're not increasing our defence spending significantly. I think we're increasing it by about $5 billion between now and 2028. So all the spending comes into the 2030s. He will say we're not doing enough. So I think that whatever happens in our own election next year, he will say that's not enough. In terms of tariffs, for ourselves, we're actually lucky that we have a significant trade deficit. So if you have a trade surplus, Trump won't like you terribly much. But since we have a trade deficit with the United States, that's good news. So we might be able to be absolved from that increase in tariffs across the board that he's flagging. In terms of what he's going to do with China, there's definitely going to be an increase in that trade war. And it will indirectly affect us because it will have an impact on the Chinese economic growth. So we'll have to see whether China has to stimulate their economy in order to counteract that. And if they do, if it's all to do with infrastructure, the kind of things that they've done before, then we might be all right, because they still need iron ore, they still need coal, they need all of that minerals that we have. But if they take a different path, then we're going to have to absolve ourselves and think to ourselves, all right, well, perhaps this is something that was always going to happen. We're going to have to wean ourselves off this dependency on China buying our minerals indefinitely.
Just find someone else to.
I don't think we'll find anyone else, frankly, but as long as it's a slow, gradual decline, which is what's anticipated, I think it will be all right. We just have to have an economy that adjusts accordingly.
Okay. Just turning back to the Trump administration, Judge, can you explain for us the concept of transition and the Trump team's approach to it, such as in relation to federal funding?
Well, in relation to federal funding, as I understand it, I haven't looked at it closely, they've rejected the federal funding and are funding it privately, which but there is some suggestion that following the inauguration that they'll release a list of the donors. But the transition period is a very interesting one. It used to be much longer. It used to be until the 20th of March, I think, until 1936. But so that's a huge gap between when a president is elected and when a president takes up office. I mean, you've seen these wonderful things when it comes to British elections. You see the moving van turning up at 10 Downing Street within an hour or so of the Prime Minister coming and seeing the King or Queen resigning his commission or her commission. But the transition period here is quite an unusual one because you'll see the difference between the way in which the president-elect has been dealt with things during the 2016-2017 transition and this transition. He was prevailed upon in 2016 and 2017 by Republican establishment figures to probably do a number of things which were contrary to his instincts. He put in place a chief of staff who was Reince Priebus, who was the previous chair of the Republican National Committee. He put in people in Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence and in this whole series of other positions which were not Trump-type people. You see now that he has decided that he's probably not going to listen to those people again. He feels that he understands how Washington works, and he's going to fix upon people. Now, he can't actually nominate anyone. He can nominate people informally, and what the Senate will do, which, as Stephen explained, is now controlled by Republicans 53 to 47. The US Constitution provides that the senators must advise and consent to the nomination of any appointment to the president's cabinet. There's a bit of a complication of that about recess appointments, but let's not worry about that at the moment. And that's very controversial and will end up in the Supreme Court. Justice Scalia, who's regarded as like God in a medieval monastery by Republican lawyers, actually has written some things which are very anti the Republicans' position. But what's going to occur over there's going to be hearings over the course of the next 7 months. And as Stephen said, there are 2 Republican senators who feel fairly liberated. Mitch McConnell, who's the former majority leader, who's no longer standing for election when his term comes up at the next midterms. He's not feeling, he doesn't like, it's fair to say, does not like Trump at all. So it's fascinating from an outsider just looking at the political dynamics as to what the Senate will do during the transition process and speaking to the administration about pushing back in relation to some of these more controversial appointments.
Well, then, in relation to appointments, Lavina, now that Matt Gaetz has withdrawn from consideration for Attorney General, who's your top pick for a Trump cabinet nominee to run into confirmation troubles, and why?
Okay, well, I think the obvious one is Peter Hegseth. I don't have to say his name properly. Hegseth. He's the nominee for the Defence Secretary. And there's been a lot of bad press coming out for him, including a lot of womanising, a claim of sexual assault that he denies, but he settled. Also that some of his colleagues in Fox News have said that he's also a bit of an alcoholic. So you put all of those 3 things together. I don't think the confirmation hearing is going to go so well for him, but it's not necessarily clear that he's completely out. But I think there's credible reports that Trump is actually talking to Ron DeSantis, the former competitor of his in the
current Florida governor.
And he has good credentials in the defense space and thinks very much like Trump about things like wokeness in the military. So I think Trump and him will see eye to eye. So if Peter is knocked out, I think we might actually see Ron DeSantis be put up in his stead.
Yeah, I must say, I would have thought if Trump was going to choose a Fox News personality for a cabinet position, he would have at least chosen a weekday, 5-day-a-week one rather than just a weekend one, which Pete Hegseth is. Judge, there's been a bit of focus in the last week or so on the so-called about the ideological diversity within the proposed Trump cabinet. Is that the case? And are there some key strands of differences amongst the nominees?
Well, you might have seen former Vice President Pence come out the last couple of days about Robert Kennedy Jr. saying the whole idea that a Republican president could appoint a environmental warrior, but more importantly, from his perspective, very pro-abortion candidate to such an important position of Health and Human Services is inconceivable, and this has no possible connection to any Republican conservative values. So I think pithily put it, he's essentially a transactional person, and what matters for him is his relationships with people rather than, and he's not an ideological person. So yes, you're going to get much more ideological diversity on certain key issues like immigration and military type issues. Yes, it's quite traditional, but when it comes, he's not a, to use an American expression, cookie cutter Republican. He's not have cookie cutter Republican social views, and so I think his administration will reflect a lack of attachment to those sort of issues.
And I think we're almost out of time, but one final question for you, Lavina. But how likely is it that the Trump administration will attempt to take some revenge on Donald Trump's perceived enemies and give favours to his allies and supporters?
Okay, I think it's clear he's already giving favours to his allies and supporters. So all of his picks, as Justice Lee has already said, he's much more experienced now. He knows what he wants. He has his own agenda. The first time around, I think he was surprised he won the election, whereas now he knows exactly what he wants to do, and he's picking people who will further that agenda, and he will hit the ground running, and he will try and get the ball rolling as quickly as possible. In terms of, yes, using his position, in the Justice Department, when we think about the prosecutions that he faced himself, I think one thing we have to remember is that all of the prosecutions he faced were by Democratic prosecutors. It's a very politicized department and system, very different from what we have here. So I think that's what it's going to happen. He's going to put his own people in the Justice Department, and he has said quite clearly that he will pick those people who have, in his words, unjustly prosecuted him.
And one of his laments in the last term was that he kept asking where his great mentor in his defining years in New York was the late US Attorney Roy Cohn. He wants to know where he kept saying, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" And he was very upset with his picks for attorney generals that they just didn't do what he wanted.
Yeah.
He's now got. He tried with Matt Gaetz. That wasn't successful. He's now putting up Pam Bondi. So, are you foreseeing that he may, for example, launch investigations into Joe Biden?
Potentially, but I think the thing that I can't tell you this. Maybe Justice Lee knows better than I do, but I thought there was something in the fact that the pardon that he gave his son was so wide in scope. I think that's because there is a lot of suspicion that Biden himself might be implicated in some of the activities related to Ukraine. So defense deals with Ukraine. And so if he's given a pardon to his son, then that makes it a bit more difficult to prosecute him as well.
Well, it goes back to the beginning of 2014 before he went on the board of Burisma, and it wouldn't stop congressional investigations and the like, which have already gone ahead, but they perhaps not be directed towards him. But who knows? Who knows?
Well, anyway, on that note, we've hit 2:00, or it's actually 2:01. So I'd like you to, it's been a fantastic discussion with our two panelists. So I'd like you to thank them in the appropriate fashion.